I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to Conversations with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, July 7th, 2022. And today we talk with friends. I call our group Companions. And I say that name, Yusuf, because I read this book by, I've said it so many times, Aikwe
Koyama.
Arma. Yeah. And it talks about the path of companions. And I was taken by the expanse and the beauty of the idea. So I'm appropriating that in my reference to you and us. I see us as companions, people that have decided that we're looking at the same thing and heading down the same path. Our commitment is to transformation, to fulfillment of our people, and to our belief that we are not locked into, subject to, condemned by the understanding that Europe has foisted on the world, that in fact, we have an opportunity and an obligation to look inward and in our own history and our own DNA to discover other ways of approaching cooperation, collaboration, and approaching the pursuit of justice in the world. So my companions are here, Yusuf, Ndugu Yusuf Mjini, Sister Angela Rose, Sister Brenda Lyle Gray. Thank you all for being here. With that, Yusuf, let me start with you, man. What's on your mind?
Well, we spoke briefly last week at the tail end of the program about the possibility of civil war. And a woman named Barbara Walter, a political science professor at the University of California at San Diego, authored a book that was released earlier this year called How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And it really is a fascinating book. There's an article about it in the Washington Post today, and I've sent you and Brenda a gift copy of the article, and I will share one with Angela as well. Her father is of German origin and lived through the war in Germany, World War II, and was absolutely terrified at the possibility of Trump becoming president because he saw so many parallels to what happened in Germany with the brown shirts, with the Nazi party, and he compared it to the Republicans, who are a quarter of an inch short of declaring outright white supremacy and are in complete denial. And in her book, she points out that in 1946, the CIA began categorizing different countries and different social indicators of what was likely to result in armed struggle. And one of the challenges that we face is that we think of the impending or possibility of a civil war based on the model of the civil war that occurred in the 1860s, rather than looking at civil wars that are breaking out around the world. And the parallels between what happened in Nazi Germany and what's happening in the United States, what's happening within the Republican Party, and their absolute idolatry as it relates to our former president is shockingly similar, as is the fact that the United States has been involved in wars all over the planet, and we have this surplus of disgruntled, trained military soldiers who are now in the civilian population. And one of the priorities for the Proud Boys, for the Boogaloo Boys, for some of these other white supremacist groups is to recruit ex-military people, soldiers, people who have munitions, explosion, weapons, skills to become members of their ranks. And then last week we talked about the president insisting that the magnetometers or metal detectors be taken down and dismantled at the January 6, 2022 rallies so that people could carry their guns onto the Capitol grounds, is just a frightening example, because What we saw on January 6th was an attempted insurrection, which, according to the participants, could have served as the springboard or the spark for a modern civil war in the United States. So I think that some of the political divisiveness, some of the clearly evident extremism, the brazen examples of white supremacy, and the attacks on people of color, Black people in particular, and other marginalized groups around the country, the shooting that occurred just north of Chicago with the July 4th parade, the shooting at Uvalde, the shootings in Las Vegas. There have been 300 mass shootings in the United States this year alone. And I'm not suggesting that all of those are in any way connected to the possibility of a civil war, but I'm suggesting that it has become more the norm, more acceptable, more commonplace for these mass shootings to take place, whether it's Black on Black or white on Black or whoever the ethnic groups happen to be. So I will shut up and allow other people to chime in and just remind you of the conversation that a mutual friend of ours, Al, had last week on a bus with a young white woman who asked him if she could ask him a personal question. And he said, sure. And she said, do you have a white family that will hide you in your basement when the race war breaks out? And she asked in all seriousness. So the preliminary indications are present. The United States, and that this CIA criteria judges countries on a scale up to +10 or -10. And the United States has been judged as low as a 5. And the closer you get to a +10, the more democratic, the less likely a civil war might break out. But we're at an 8 right now. So we're not a perfect country. Mm-hmm. And at certain times, we do sink down on this CIA scale, which predicts the probability of armed civil insurrection or civil war. So,
well, Yusuf, let me ask you to go deeper on that description you made explaining the parallel similarities between where we are right now and Nazi Germany in the 30s and the public acceptance of the devaluing of Jewish life and that led to the murder, right? The annihilation, extermination of millions. And so the question is there a lesson there for us? Because we sort of walk around in our everydayness thinking that that's not possible, that there's just no way. But the problem is that's obviously what the Jewish people thought in 1930s, sure. when lo and behold, they were rounded up, and carted off into concentration camps. And then even in their disbelief that the impossible could not happen, they met the impossible, and that was mass death, mass murder at the hands of the state. So the question is, we know what human beings can do and have done, and how should we be looking at, and would you describe, how that looks to you as a scenario that we should be aware of?
Well, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, the mass of white supremacists who gathered in Charlottesville are contemporary brown shirts, Al. And their behavior is no different. The attack on the synagogue in Philadelphia several months ago is a clear example of hatred toward Jewish people. We can go all the way back to Dylan Roof in North Carolina, who was invited into a church to pray with Black people, Mother Emanuel Church, and killed a dozen people in the church. And then the police took him to Burger King to get him a Happy Meal on the way to the police station because he said he was hungry. There are some seriously deranged, misguided people with mental health issues in our community who are easily swayed and sucked into some of these extremist groups and are only too willing to go out and practice these bizarre beliefs. about, who the reprobates, which is a Calvinist term that meant those whom God has bypassed, are in our community, and their willingness to try and attack them. And Francis Welsing pointed out that the root cause of anti-Black racism is the fear of genetic annihilation. And as white people become the numerical minority in this country, the new minorities, it's a very difficult situation for many of them on the extreme right to put their arms around or embrace, because they do feel that they're losing the privileges that they've enjoyed as a birthright for centuries. And this whole thing about make America great again basically is code for make America white again. And we see it in terms of the attempts to eliminate Black voting strength through redistricting. We see it in the attempts at voter suppression. We see it in the media, on social media in particular, and across the spectrum. And it's very present and very dangerous. So it means that we need to educate ourselves. We need to inform and educate others, and we need to be aware of what some of the possibilities are and examine ways to minimize or eliminate them or prevent them at the very least. So the book is very interesting because it uncovers a number of parallels in the United States today that stem from political division and extremism.
Brenda, you and I were on yesterday talking about this question of the potential of a civil war. I just remembered that in a previous program like this, Kamal King raised the issue several times that he thought the country was moving dangerously close. And I think last Thursday, I raised the question again, and Professor Bernil Powell raised the same question. He said, well, he's not Nostradamus and predicting gloom and doom. He acknowledged that certain conditions exist that are not positive. So the question, Brenda, what do you hear us saying we should be doing? And Yusef and Angela, then I'll come to you. Any comments or thoughts, Brenda Lyle Gray?
I think taking care of business in our own communities. Let me underscore, not being silent about our children in schools and the disparities, and being silent when people are constantly asking what happened or where is the surplus going to help our communities, and money from the government, period, across the country. These disparities have not, gotten smaller. They're getting wider when it comes to our children. Al, I thought you had a good point. Angela and Yusef, it was 3 publishers that were interviewed. Ken Miller, Inglewood Today, and Cheryl Smith with Texas News, and Al McFarlane with Insight News. And, one of the publishers said, we won't go, and I just wrote about this, so it's kind of fresh on my mind. We're not going to go any further without bloodshed. And so Al kind of leaned back and thought about it, and he said, I just find that counterproductive. And I had to think about that, because right now, until we are able to strengthen ourselves as a people, and that means making for sure that all of BIPOCs are qualified and registered to vote. We're talking about, Dr. Ben Chavez said, hashtag 10 million new Black voters. So I also watched the tape our video or whatever from the Boston march. They called it a hate march. And that was Saturday before the 4th. And one of them got on there were 100 of them or more. And then they also, I think, caught another U-Haul with about 40 of them that had the same khaki pants on and the same uniform. Their faces were covered. And the mayor from Boston, who is Asian American, and Michelle Wu, and she was just, beside herself because it was a surprise. And they got on the megaphone and they said, "You can take your safety, but you're not taking anything else because you don't own anything in this country." So I think we should expect the unexpected on November 8th, 2022. But we need to be prepared. And we need to be prepared more than we ever have before. We owe it to our children. So,
Angela, jump in. Angela, react to this and move the conversation where you want it to go. What's on your mind, Angela?
Yes, no, I mean, I definitely hear everything that everyone's saying. And I mean, I'm an Afro pessimist, right? I do believe that
I've heard you say that before.
it's an ideology within critical race theory and Black studies that the pillars of American exceptionalism and American democracy in the world and reality that we live in today will implode on itself because of the exploitation of Black labor and Black folk. And white supremacy is, inherently unsustainable without the exploitation of labor and resources. And so that the world probably will end, right? But I also believe that beyond this current iteration of our democracy, there's always an opportunity. We are at a place of great transformation in our country's history. If you just look at even the negative and the positive aspects of the Supreme Court recent rulings, of the EPA saying that the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have the right to create laws that will limit basically pollution exodus from companies or things like that, or just even how the Supreme Court regulates women's bodies. These are all turning points in our democracy where every moment that something happens, we have to continue to ask ourselves, well, what are we going to do about it? What are our next steps if we want to preserve this democracy or create a new reality or a new democracy? And with that, I think about William Gladstone, Prime Minister William Gladstone from the 1800s. He's known as the creator of modern day welfare states, like in the good sense, not in the way it's been kind of co-opted, right? Of modern day ideas of how a government or a country can take care of its people, the least empowered and the impoverished. And he said, it is the duty of the government to make it easy to do right and to make it difficult to do wrong. And right now we're in this moment where I feel like, unfortunately, particularly if you are white, right, it's easy to do wrong. And then particularly if you are Black, it is difficult to do right. I was just talking to a business owner, right? A Black woman business owner in Minneapolis. And she said, I got my master's degree, and because of my student loans, I was unable to get a business loan. So there are, unfortunately, people in our community who are doing right, who are taking the steps that we've always been told we need to take and do everything right. But yet it's still difficult for us to get to a point where we can survive and live our lives. And so to what Miss Brenda was saying earlier of how we need to prepare ourselves, right? This has been intentionally difficult for us to prepare ourselves for upcoming changes in our democracy, in our country, and to even survive and thrive in this country. And so, yes, we do need to band together, and however we can organize to build a new reality is what we need to do, and to kind of like keep the real motivating factor that you opened up with for this program central to our motivation. Our motivation is not to mitigate a major transformation in our democracy, our country, or to, stop, to stop a civil war. But the real motivating factor is to make sure that Black people survive, thrive, and live in this country from this day to tomorrow and on for generations. And we can in this world together and thrive. So, that's our crucial central motivating factor, and to not lose sight of that while, there are white lashes. And so a white lash is essentially a backlash by white folk, white supremacists, to gains that Black folk get, whether through the democratic process or just imagined by white folk in general, that we're somehow getting gains, right? And there will always be a white lash. But yet we still haven't prepared ourselves adequately for these white lashes that'll happen. And so, that is also something to think about, is how we can, as a community, really stand on our pillars of our community, really support the people who are doing well, the Black business owners, Black politicians, Black thinkers, our Black students, our Black youth, how we can support them for the future. And then also, to really think about and expect white people to be angry about it. And then expect and stay 2 steps ahead of them, 10 steps ahead of 100 steps ahead of them on mitigating that violence so that we survive, and to protect Black people, not white feelings. I'll just say that.
Well, that's a lot, and thank you for saying it and saying it so well. Let me ask you to go deeper with the idea of, here's Jonathan. Jonathan is in Scotland. Hey, Jonathan, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing pretty good. Hello, everybody. Coming to you from Glasgow.
Okay, Glasgow, Scotland. Great.
What time is it there?
It is 7:30. I'm 6 hours ahead of you guys.
Oh, okay.
Well, so that's a good time to sort of pivot a little bit, because before we started, Angela brought the question up of the potential, or the resignation, or the ouster of Johnson in London. And Angela, start with that first of all, and then Jonathan, come in and tell us what you're hearing on the ground in Europe about the politics of Great Britain.
Well, I'll start actually with Brexit in 2016, right? So that's really when Boris Johnson's government came into power with Brexit, with the British exit of the European Union. And Boris Johnson, to me, always seemed like the British Donald Trump, kind of flying by the seat of his pants, not really focused on supporting all of the citizens of the UK. And then with the COVID pandemic, he kind of also, again, pushed, everyone should just get sick and we'll have herd immunity. And that was, again, bizarre for some prime minister. And then we find out months later that even during this time of COVID, when there were restrictions placed on the British citizens on going out and things like that, he literally had parties at the, it's like the British White House. It's where the prime minister lives. Yes, exactly. And so he had parties. He had his own birthday parties. And most recently, a scandal has come out with the fact that one of the folks that he elevated to a position of power in his party was a sexual predator. And at first he said that he did not have no knowledge of this. And then he said that he did have knowledge, but forgot because this wasn't the top of his agenda. And over the last week, multiple up to 60 of the MPs have resigned in his government. And this comes about 3 months after already there was questions about whether he would step down. He didn't. He at the time still had the confidence of the government, and he continued his leadership. And today he came out and he said that he might not have the full confidence of everyone, but he's still going to do what he wants to do. He's still going to be the leader of the country momentarily. And so currently the UK is in a little bit of a realignment, misunderstanding. Exactly. What we would call a constitutional crisis about leadership they have in the UK currently around what is the leadership and the foregoing of the UK parliamentary system right now. And this is also in the same moment when people are calling for the downfall of the monarchy, but that is a side conversation. But again, in the UK happening.
Jonathan, good to see you. Thank you for pulling over and jumping on the conversation in the early evening there in Glasgow, Scotland. Say why you're there, number one, and whatever else is on your mind, but you're in a position to tell us what is going on the ground, what you're hearing in the news in the United Kingdom.
Well, first of all, thanks. It's good to see everybody. The reason why I am here in Scotland is my clan McFarlane, Al McFarlane, has had its AGM, which is our annual general meeting. So every 3 years when we do it in Scotland and come back here. We take kind of a tour of the homelands and some of the sites. So I've been posting some of the pictures. We've shown some of the historical sites throughout. In addition to that, what we had was a Highland gathering, which is something that has not occurred before. Bringing together, this time it was about 6 Highland clans, most of which have had rivalries and animosities in the past. And we're coming together to say, hey, let's put all of that aside and let's work together for the betterment and the promotion of our culture. We had some friendly competition, which Clan McFarlane was the winner of. So we have the trophy for that. But it was hosted by Clan Calhoun, who was actually one of our chief rivals. We used to steal their cattle. And what you will find is every Scottish clan did something bad. Everyone was, murderers or stealers or something like that. We were so good at stealing cattle at night that the moon was referred to as McFarlane's lantern. So all of us are moving past that and saying, hey, let's just get together and share our common heritage. Let's try and promote and help connect people to roots that they have. And promote Scottish culture and share that with people. And so it's been very interesting last week and this week doing that. We did most of that in last week. This week we've been touring some of the different places. My family's from a small town called Dunkeld, which is north and west of Edinburgh. And you'd only know it for one of 3 reasons. Macbeth is set there. It was the religious center of the time for a few hundred years. And then Beatrix Potter wrote Peter Rabbit and her other stories while on vacation there, inspired by the landscape. So over here doing that, connecting in with other members of our Scottish clan and talking about things that we're going to be doing. It's been a really great trip, a lot of great connections to history. And a lot of talk about what the future is, and even got interviewed by the BBC. So you may see that at some point. As far as, thank you, Angela, that she covered exactly all of the foundation that has led up to this moment. That the idea of the resignation has been the top topic of discussion on every news channel. So, there's a number of BBC channels over here. So you flip through and you'll see a number of different ones. and they've been talking about the fact that the multiple resignations, the desire for the resignation, the lack of confidence. The big thing is his own cabinet saying that the government has to have integrity, and it doesn't. Or they don't explicitly say that, but they imply that the government has to have integrity, and so they're resigning because of that. And I think where they are right now is that Johnson will stay on as a caretaker PM, prime minister, and that will reduce a lot of his power. They will go. He'll govern in line with the convention, or the practices an outgoing prime minister takes on. So people really want him to go because of the fact of everything that Angela was talking about, just the lack of integrity, the breaking of the rules, and everybody feeling that way. And I think Angela described him perfectly. He was the British version of Donald Trump. I would say a little bit smarter than Donald, but still with the same attitude of I do what I want, when I want, and however I want. So yeah, it's really top of the mind up here, and the big topic of conversation. And we're watching it at the same time that the January 6th hearings are going on, and it's just there's so much shifting in the world power base right now. So that's another big topic of discussion.
Well, that's a great point of departure. The question becomes, Jonathan and Angela, we are watching this, but what does it mean to us? What's the connection? Why does this conundrum that the UK finds itself in matter to us? And I think that question has to be raised about what's happening in Ukraine, between that country and Russia. And that also is related to, at one level, what happened in Chicago. We didn't see ourselves at the center of this particular mass shooting in Chicago, but it could have been us. And the ones before did involve our people in Buffalo or our people in Uvalde. So make the connection, Angela and Jonathan. Why should it matter to us? Why should paying attention to this in some way or another have us focused on how this affects our mission, our vision, our bid for freedom?
Jonathan, you want to start, Angela, or you want me to jump?
Jonathan first, and then Angela.
Okay. So I think that there's a couple of really key points. One, the UK has been one of the US's greatest allies on the world stage. And because of that, the things that are happening here will impact us in several different components. One, you see what's happening in the financial markets. It's going to affect trade. It's going to affect some of the balance of power. But what I think more of which it flies into is looking at the shape of what people are willing to take with regards to leadership. When Donald Trump got elected, then you started to see these other world leaders come out that were very similar, and that's what they got compared to. The next Donald Trump, or this is the British version of Donald Trump. And those pieces came along. As you're seeing at least a level of accountability being held for Donald Trump. We're not quite there yet, but there's at least the information is coming out that we hadn't seen before. You can see much more clearly how much that was wrong with that administration, that was going on behind the scenes. You're seeing ripple effects in the UK with the same kind of thing, that people, I hope, are being fed up with this kind of leadership and saying we need change. We need to get back to a leadership that makes sense. The impact on the world stage with this and with things like Ukraine is because it ties into our resources. One of the most fascinating pieces for me when Ukraine started talking about needing help, that police departments were showing up, sending over military grade weapons in order to aid the Ukraine. So one, it was good that they were helping to aid the Ukraine, but then the question goes, why do the police have military grade weapons? And now we suddenly find out about that. Then that went really quiet all of a sudden. As soon as you heard about it, then you stopped hearing about it. And the fact that that kind of stuff shows what we are really up against when people aren't paying attention to hide something away. So I think all of this has ripple effects, if not direct impact, on the relations we have around the world, the power dynamic, and who gets to lead that at some point.
Angela, jump in.
Well, I see that you have a new guest as well, and you feel free to introduce them as well.
We'll bring Maestri Yoji Sena in momentarily, but go ahead and respond to the question. Yoji is joining us from Bahia in Brazil.
Oh, fantastic. Well, mucho gusto. So basically we have a world now that is more globally linked than it's ever been. And the roots of American imperialism falls under British imperialism, right, and empire. And even though England might be across the Atlantic, there are folks in our own we're not borders. I mean, I guess you could say Canada, maybe, a little bit, but also, I'm thinking about the Caribbean and all of the countries in the Caribbean that still reflect and replicate the British parliamentary system, who still have the Queen as their head of state. Things that are happening in England do have ripple effects across the world. I'd also point to NATO, and I'd also point to the UN. And the UN has a Security Council that has 5 countries that will forever be on that Security Council. And these 5 countries have veto power over the functions of the UN. And the US, England, France, Russia, and China are those 5 countries, right? So what the world turmoil looks like when those 5 countries, which were built and thought to be the most secure, most stable countries in the world, are all in turmoil. What does that look like for the governance of the UN, which is our international governing body that oversees refugee camps that are growing by millions of people every year? They oversee, things of environmental security and degradation that's happening across the world. They impose sanctions on different countries. So, the governance that's within those 5 countries matters. And so for the UK to be falling apart, for the US to be falling apart, for France, which just had a recent election that pushed more right wing, that is scary. And for the polarization within Russia and China happening too, that is scary. And there are potential ramifications that happen globally. So our economy, as we have it, unfortunately, we have very few jobs in the US that will support American workers for the life, right, for the comfort of life that they currently have. And all of the products that we consume in our mass, consumerism culture that we have, a lot of them are not made from the US, in the US. They are made outside of the US. So, wars, government instability in other countries really will impact not only the average American, but also the American worker. It will impact, we're already seeing economic impacts when it comes to Bitcoin and other stock markets. And so, it's unfortunate. We're in a bear economy right now, and we're probably only going to see increased inflation and food shortages to actual consumer shortages, so product shortages. And we've seen it already, and we can't just blame COVID. We also have to blame ourselves for not protecting and giving a little bit of insulation to our own economy. But, these are the issues of globalization. There was a assumption that the US, the UK, France, Russia and China would always be stable, and that is a false assumption. It was based on this idea of American exceptionalism, or an exceptionalism of these, few countries where instability can happen to anyone, anywhere.
Too big to fail. Let me bring in Maestre Yoji Sena, who's joining us from Bahia, Brazil. And Yoji, good to see you, my brother. How are you, man?
I'm doing all right today.
Good. How's the family? How's your son doing? Doing better?
It's been up and down.
Okay.
Right now in the middle.
Okay. Well, join the conversation. We're talking generally about this question of, the struggle in the power arena, both in Britain, and we tried to internationalize the conversation by hearing from our brother Jonathan Palmer, who's over in Scotland right now. It's wonderful to have you joining the conversation from Brazil. And before I have you talk, I want to read or show a comment that's come in the chat from Lawrence Hayes. He says, protecting African-American interests. African Americans need to first understand that the white nationalist supremacist movement in America targets African Americans as their primary targets. Unfortunately, my experience with Africans from other parts of African diaspora, is what he means, I think, indicate they take no interest in understanding the rights and privileges they enjoy in America, derived from African American blood, sweat, tears, and historical struggles. Saying that, he points to WB. There's more to follow, but I'll stop with that. And you might weigh in as a person who spent 30 years in Minnesota, but from Bahia, who's returned to Bahia. And Jonathan, you might weigh in as a person who's examining, your historical roots, yours and mine, my patrimonial or patrilineal roots. As you said, go right back to where you are, Scotland, Ireland. And Yusef, you and I have talked about this off and on, about our connections beyond our Africanity, that we're not, it's not a question of either or, it's both and all. But Yoji, what are your thoughts?
Well, all this, actually today I was, just like a few minutes ago, I was reading an article about the definitions of race of the American Census Bureau, how it evolves, and I think they are trying now. It was about the title of the article was "Are Jews White?" And then they went through the classifications that they have in America to people's race. So I don't know if you guys know that Egyptians or people that are Arab or Berber, let's say mostly the traditional Islamic from out Morocco to Syria, they are legally considered white in America. In the United States also, I want to correct, because I'm in America also. So so
it's true.
Yes, and also to the sister Rose, I'm in Brazil, the biggest country of the Americas. Brazil is bigger than the United States if you exclude Alaska, and we are the only country that doesn't speak Portuguese. So even though I do speak Spanish very well, we don't speak Spanish in Brazil. We speak Portuguese. So the preponderance of the identification of race, it's very powerful in the United States. Here, there is similar things, but also social class sometimes supersedes those definitions, right? And so about the subject, when I just log in, that you guys talking about guns and shooting outs and stuff like that, where Brazil, we have our own Trump is still in power, that are in many ways being trying to follow certain of those lead that was made legitimate by Donald Trump. So here, for example, the population has been arming themselves. Now there is a numerous number of guns on hands of civilians, even though that still there is not mass shootings as is in the US. So, and then with the question of the United Nations Security Council, that they included China and Russia at that moment, right after the Second World War, was just because of the case they were nuclear armed countries, but there is a tyranny in the world also, of the United States and England particularly. France is there because also they've always been a nuclear armed country, and they have some preponderance historically. But what made them eligible to be part of the Security Council is that stuff, because Spain historically has been much more important than France is not part of the Security Council because it's not a nuclear armed country. So I think all of this, it is a very clear system of white supremacism that they have very different levels. There is the macro level, as the sister mentioned, the United Nations as some sort of world governance, which many people in America are against the United Nations, because it would imply submission of the United States. But when we think about the United States, it's been clear now that United States is the Caucasian that are here. So things are changing in America. Social progress happens only when there is commotion and the system find a way to keep its status quo intact or profit from this progress. So that's, we could mention abortion, civil rights, intermarriage, opening of immigration. So the United States has always been, in my point of view, a very oppressive country, but has mastered ideas of marketing propaganda earlier than other countries, and has, because of that, have a step ahead of the others to be seen as this benign. So you also mentioned Ukraine and other stuff. We are all saddened and emotional about Ukraine and send weapons and all of this. But in a certain way, the United States has also done similar things to other nations, and nobody says anything. Nobody, when I say it's not me or you, but the other countries, right? And if you notice, now China is kind of abstaining from say, and Russia is the other one, but France, UK, and the United States are in the same. So
let me ask Yusuf to jump in. Yusuf, react and respond if you would. What are your thoughts, Yusuf?
He's absolutely correct, my brother. And Grenada is one example. You can look at the wars the United States has been involved in around the continent, and it's difficult to find the ones where we were on the right side. It's been about, when you talk about protecting what's in the best interest of America, what it meant was what's in the best interest of Wall Street, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was, Korea, you name it. And the United States has benefited from the exploitation and oppression of the people, the mineral rights in those countries. We have 83 military bases on the continent of Africa in 53 independent African nations. Why do we need 83 military bases?
Answer that. What's the reason? Examine that.
To protect what they define as being in the best interest of America. The minerals and the other precious materials that are necessary for flat screens and for smartphones and for, the information economy that we have. Here in the Twin Cities, much of the GNP in Minnesota is either agricultural or it's information based. You got controlled data, you got 3M, you got all these companies that sell information related products. And it drives more than 50 cents in every dollar in our economy, because we're not manufacturing, we're not producing, we're not home based, and it's very obvious. The other reality, Al, is that in our classrooms, the United States teaches little or nothing about what's happening beyond the geographic borders of the United States. So when you talk about global or international issues, people look like a deer in the headlights because they've had no training, no exposure, no interest in what's happening anywhere else in the world other than, in their own backyard. And it's embarrassing because I went on a trip to East Germany with a bunch of legislators and philanthropists, philanthropoids, whatever you want to call them. And these kids in a 9th grade gymnasium in East Germany knew more about what was happening in Minnesota than the people in the legislature or the people from some of the largest corporate and foundation giving programs in the state of Minnesota. And it was funny as hell to see the embarrassment and their red faces when these 9th grade kids were asking them questions about Minnesota and then had to answer those questions for the people who were supposed to represent the power structure in Minnesota. So
I would agree, and I would also say,
let me do this. Let me. Yoji had a response first of all. Yoji, then Angela, then Jonathan. Yoji, go ahead.
Well, the idea with that the brother before talking, let me, Mr. Yusuf. Yeah, I don't take with Twitter and say the United States is ethnocentric, right? It thinks of itself as the center of the world.
Sure.
When you talk about America or Americans, overall is included, is assumed to be the white Americans, unless we talk about cultural issues where Black Americans and sports, that also Black Americans are the front, but still they are used overseas as this propaganda tool of the benesses of America. So by being ethnocentrist and not knowing of who surrounds us is also in a certain way how allows the environment in the United States to be insulated from the rest. So, for example, don't want to be disrespectful, but for example, people think the capital of Brazil, a lot of people think that's Buenos Aires. And they and they think we speak Spanish.
look, I would say this to your earlier comment. My friend, he says my Portuguese is so bad it sounds like Spanish. My Spanish is so bad it sounds like Latin. But I will say that to exactly your point earlier is there have been in the history of global our African American organizing, even the global push for Pan-Africanist organizing within and outside of international institutions. And two times I think that are really major times are when W.E.B. Du Bois pressed with other activists, with the African American Civil Rights Council, with the Civil Rights Council in the 1950s, we charged genocide, and they sent a we charge genocide document to the UN charging genocide within the US. and then also with the the Organization for African Unity, of decolonialist African states, as well as African Americans in the U.S. pushing for decolonization, one being Malcolm X. The want was for Pan-Africanist states to push the UN and actually take it over or form new organizations of Black unity and Black global structures. But in every case, right, the institutions themselves tried to shut this type of organizing down. And even the fundamental point to what Yusuf was talking about earlier of education, this is by design, right? So I really had the pleasure of being in Brazil a couple of years ago for the Fifth World Conference to Remedies to Racial and Ethnic Economic Inequalities. That was in Victoria, Brazil. And one of the main things that came out of it was that Black scholars even don't have full opportunities to discuss and to talk face to face and build international ties that are centered around Blackness. And it's hard to do even when, if you take the example of Brazil versus the US, we have two different definitions of what race and Blackness might be. And in the US, it is very codified, and it has a history of codification from the one drop rule, which was one drop of Black blood made you Black. So even if you walked up in here looking, with blue eyes, blonde hair, if you had a Black ancestor that everybody knew about in that town, you were Black, considered Black. And in the history of our census, we also had, different terms that have changed from Negro, even subterms of mulatto, octoroon being in the census. And then to the point where some races, folks who don't even believe themselves to be an ethnicity, but a race, they weren't seen as a race in the census until recently. The census didn't count them until recently. Like the Mexican heritage, basically that created Latino identity. Though we know Mexicans and Latinos were in this country before, this was a country.
I'd like to add something. You mentioned that Mexicans, you make all these distinctions. For example, this article that I was reading before, there are Jews, white, and the classifications there in the census that, for example, Arabs or Islamic of North Africa are considered white in the United States. For example, the term Hispanic. So because of a language, it became transliterated for a race. And I see Mexicans, as far as national identity, very different from an Argentinian, from a Colombian. But what they have in common is they are Native Americans mixed with Black people, because what we know them about their cultural exuberance, our cultural exuberance, and is a Mexican. It's not different from a Native American. Mexican, they're not Mexican, right? The Colombian,
yes, but this was
a
specific term in our census for a short while, which created just what you're saying of dissension. And you're absolutely right, because there are Black Mexicans who have 100% Afro, Black African heritage, and even states that are known for that of Black heritage in Mexico, to the point where even when the Mexican Revolution happened and independence, they decided that they were going to free enslaved people in Mexico. And that was a point of dissension in Texas, where enslaved people went to Mexico to become free. And we know of the, trail north, right, for freedom, but also there was an underground railroad south to Mexico for freedom. And those communities still exist to this day.
Can
Jonathan,
I add a little?
Jump in, because
hold
if I
on,
don't
you jump
far
in,
away
Jonathan.
from Yusef's point that I wanted to comment on, people won't forget what he said. So Yusef was talking about how they don't teach in the schools about the international affairs, and I think it continues even worse than that, in that not only don't they teach, but they put propaganda into the schools that teach you that the reason why we have 83 bases all over the world is to protect freedom. Mm-hmm. Freedom becomes the buzzword and the hallmark, and this propaganda becomes so ingrained in our society that when you start talking like we are, people think it's conspiracy theories. People think you're just coming up with stuff and it's crazy to talk about this. And then you start to see the impacts on the world stage and what happens when we are into inserting ourselves into other places and not inserting ourselves into all the places. We pick and choose where we get involved in and who we support and how we support that. It was very clear with what was going on in the Ukraine. You saw we didn't just jump in and bring the US military. We said, we'll help. We'll give you some guidance. Here, we're going to give you these old weapons, but we're not going to give you these because then Russia will consider this attack and then we'll end up in a war with Russia. So it's all very strategic in what they're doing. And it ties into the overall idea of, one, American exceptionalism and the idea that America is the greatest country in the world and that we do all this great freedom promotion, and yet we can't take care of our own people. And we also invest so much in helping people outside the country, more so than we do investing in people inside of the country. And when we're talking about the census and what that means and about race in America, that ties even further back to 100 years ago. So 100 years ago this year, Takaya Ozawa went and petitioned the United States to be classified as Caucasian, because at that time you had to be white to own property. You really had to be white, and he wanted to be classified as white because Japanese was not listed on the census, and so his case, and this is part of what feeds into redlining, but his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that no, you can't be classified as white because it's about science and the precedence that has that. So Bhagat Singh was watching this whole case because he too put in a year later, 1923, a petition to be classified as white because he identified as Aryan anthropologically. His culture connected into it. Again, all the way up to the Supreme Court, they said, no, you're not white. It's not about science. You just know who is white. So the rules change. And that's what our country has been great at, changing the rules to fit the narrative that fits the program that they've got in order to maintain the control power structures and in order to maintain the resources for the powers that be.
Jonathan, the definitions changed too, because periodically throughout history, different groups have been included within the classification of white who were denied that definition, for decades prior to it. Every time the white community felt that their majority was being threatened, they would add East Indians. They would add another group that was classified as white. But I just want to remind us that despite the horror of the tragedy in Highland Park over the July 4th weekend, that it was overshadowed silently by the number of Black people who lost their lives in gunfire on the south side of Chicago. And we need to remember that, and that's a discussion that we have to have about some of the challenges and hopefully opportunities that exist within our own community.
And we can't forget about Jalen Walker and 90 bullets. I don't want that to, maybe that's another discussion for another day.
Absolutely.
But we need to talk about that one. That's
Brother
all.
Louis Alamayu from here is listening and sent a note, homicide and suicide walking hand in hand. I think he was referring to comments you were making early on, Youssef. And Louis, if you're still listening and want to put another note explaining the comment, please put it in the chat. We'd love to have you on the program in the conversation as well. I've got a few extra minutes. I mean, I'm willing to keep this conversation going. It's so rich and so wonderful to have all of us together in this conversation. So I'm not going to be, limiting us to having to shut down in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. We can let this thing just go to where it wraps itself up. I'm loving the conversation. So Yusuf, if you want to take more time, Brenda, if you want to bring more questions up, please do it.
Well, brother Yogi in Bahia, I know he also had something a little bit more to say, but I had cut him off, and so I apologize publicly for cutting you off as well.
I'm sorry. It's okay.
The lady.
But I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Yogi.
My name is Yogi, not Yogi.
Oh,
Okay,
see.
Yogi.
And I
Okay.
never done yoga in my life.
Yogi.
Yogi.
But I'm gonna say something. Two things I want to leave in there. Do you know where is the first and the second African population in the world? And second, I want to bring. Do you know why is this historical beef about the Russians and Western Europe? Right? One of the euphemism for white is Caucasian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the Caucasus is west of Russia. So the first and the second African population in the world is, the first is Nigeria, and the second is Brazil.
Yeah.
Our population in Brazil right now is 210 million, and 54% of Brazilians in the last census declared themselves to be black, which is strikingly different from the anterior census, where we have several denominations to ourselves. For example, my first ID card in Brazil, my race was pardo. Pardo means an undefined color, but that became a race. Pardo means is a color of a cat in the twilight of the day. Pardo, it's undefined. So, other very interesting thing to you guys might be interested to know. As I say, the second largest African population of the world is in Brazil. We are always left out by African Americans when they mention our diasporic struggle. It's very surprising. I have that reaction many times from Black Americans that I was Brazilian, right? So 2/3 of the African American, 2/3 of the Black people that have the citizenship of the United States, they came from Brazil. They 1/3 only came straight from Africa, because you guys know that the slave trade was
Less than that, Yogi.
Huh?
Less than 1/3 of Africans
Okay.
came directly to the United States.
Yeah, because the slave trade was prohibited by England, I think, in 1808, and because was the transatlantic trade was prohibited, but the intra-America was not prohibited. So all the rebellions for the sheer numbers of Black people in Brazil was all the rebellions that were here. One of the way of control was to export the Negroes to the U.S. and to the Caribbean. The culture of rum, right, the drinking, that is our cachaça here, and the cigar came from Brazil when the Dutch was expelled from here, and they took that knowledge in that industry, and they went to the Caribbean and New York. In a certain way, there's a great participation of in its foundation of Brazilian Jews, Brazilian Portuguese Jews, that they have refuge here. The oldest synagogue of the whole America is in the city of Recife, here in the northeast, like a few 100 kilometers from here. So the aspect is very much sometimes complex and interconnected. But what I think is, in a certain way, I remember when I arrived in the US in 1992, and right after that, because you guys were also talking about the globalization. I was thinking at that time, I said, like, how come the United States is sending all the manufacturing overseas? Right? Why was that? It's because China was a slave pool, what were paid to the Chinese workers at that time was so little that would make sense in the capitalist mind of the United States to send all these jobs overseas that end up 30, 40 years later empower China in a great deal that now threatens the livelihood of the Americans. Created a lot of social turmoil in the United States that also fomented this resurgence of white pride or white supremacists, because then all of a sudden China became the boogeyman. But there were deliberate policies of sending those jobs, those manufacturing jobs to China, as they are trying now, or to send to India or to Vietnam, because there is low wages.
Cheap labor.
So, huh?
Cheap labor.
Exactly.
Cheap
Right.
labor.
So, yes. So, but cheap labor is associated with slavery too.
Mhm.
You know, it's a little bit more of step up of slavery, but it's like Dickensian, like how was the Industrial Revolution in England. So we don't discuss when we talk about this, not we us, but society in general, or the people who have more preponderance to their opinions to be heard and listened to talk about those issues. That is much more complicated, because globalization is not new. It just got repaginated now. Why the Russians have this beef with Western Europe? It started with Peter the Great in the 1700s, when Peter the Great came to power and decided that Russia needed to become a European nation. But the Western Europeans never saw he was to be educated in England and all stuff, was always discriminated, because the Western Europeans see the Russians as not white. They are a mix of Vikings and Central Asians. And
Yoji, how do we? And I want to throw this to Jonathan. How do we personalize the history? The history that you're referring to is something that we both studied and learned in high school or university about power in Europe and among Europeans, and how they positioned themselves as the center and the definition of what the world is. But then, Jonathan, you are in Scotland right now, a Black man, an African whose lineage is bloodline, like mine, is to Scotland. How do we navigate and negotiate our commitment to our Africanity, to creating an African way of knowing, and to creating liberation, freedom for African people, and at the same time have that show up in all of our relationships, all of our genealogy, our DNA? What do you think, Jonathan? How do you navigate your kente and the kilt?
I like that, Al. I'm going to use that. This is going to sound very simple, like I'm simplifying it, but it's not. I think you just do it. And what I mean by that is, there was a time, Angela brought up earlier the one drop rule. There was a time before where white people got to define who we are and what constitutes us. We're not in that place anymore. We're in a new space, especially with the recent rise of Black Lives Matter as a movement, and people becoming more aware of that, and that becoming a global piece. There is attention and focus, and the door is open right now for us to say, I am African and Scottish, and I can honor both heritage without discarding either one of those, or raising one more important than the other, that they're both a part of who I am.
How do we address that part of the Scottish identity, the Irish identity, the English, the Dutch, the French, Portuguese identity is an identity built in the enslavement, built on the enslavement of African people. And so, I'm wondering, and Yogi, this applies to you as well. You and I were in a meeting a few days ago where we connected with Lagosians, people in Lagos who had been in Brazil, who had found and fought and acquired freedom and returned in fairly substantial numbers to Nigeria. So Yoruba people who are Brazilian, who had Yoruba traditions in their community in Brazil, returned and built a community in Lagos. That had to also address the question of African complicity with Europeans in the sale of other human beings. How do you see us untangling that and moving towards solutions that represent a path of healing for all of humankind? And I'm going to have Angela come back to this in a few minutes because I think you're thinking about that too. Jonathan, what do you think? And Yusuf, what do you think?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's about educating people. So one of the popular misconceptions that always comes up when you start talking about slavery is, oh, they had slaves in Greece and they had slaves in Rome and Africa had slaves and they were part of it. The concept of slavery in the transatlantic slave trade is different from any other kind of slavery. When you had slavery in African tribes, it was primarily when one tribe or one region defeated another, and you became what is more equivalent to an indentured servant. You could buy yourself out of slavery, you could work out of it, you could marry who you wanted, you could own property, you could do all those things. In American slavery, none of that held true. You would be divided up from people that spoke the same language. You would be divided up from family members. There was an intentionality around it and a brutality around it that led to many of the different shades of brown people that we have today, that led to the different pieces of not being connected to heritage. And so educating people and bringing that to the forefront so that they understand part of the reason why you have those Yoruba traditions is the Ivan Van Sertima's book that came before Columbus, which connects into the triangular trade that was going on with Africa and the Americas hundreds of years before Columbus. So there's a lot of pieces of knowledge that needs to be brought to the forefront. And when we're talking about making people aware of what slavery and how it was involved, you're seeing a reflection of that in Europe much quicker than you are in the US in terms of companies and organizations acknowledging their role, going ahead and doing things from apologies to some remediation. Georgetown University is now providing free college tuition to people who are descendants of the slaves that helped build Georgetown University. So you're seeing that come much more on a national stage where there's an acknowledgement of that. There's a desire to move to that. I was just talking with and the archive, one of the archives over here that does the Scottish history. And one of the things that the funding organization, it's a government funding organization, is asking them to do is have a plan that is about increasing diversity and increasing that component and recognizing that. So the myth that Scotland is nothing but white people, it's not true. There are much more Black and brown people here than people know, and there's a recognition of that and starting to come more and more across Europe. So I think it's more keeping these issues at the forefront, having strategies built in, and being able to say to somebody, you can acknowledge more than one part of your heritage, and you don't have to raise one above the other. But in order to center the part that has been neglected for so long, that is the piece that needs to be elevated so that it's kept at the same level and sometimes a little bit higher in order to make up for the past. So when I show up places with my kente and my kilt, I am not apologetic about who I am. I am not apologetic about where I come from. I have worn the kilt down at Morehouse. I have worn the kente over here in Scotland. And in all of those, I am the same person who has the same beliefs. And I talk to people, I educate people. And the more we do that, the more it changes hearts and minds and eventually policy, which is where we get into how governments dictate what is going to happen.
Yusuf, what do you think?
Well, Al, I mentioned on an earlier program that the one drop rule is also known as the little dabble do ya. And I am inclined to agree with Dr. Ron Karenga that race is three things: color, culture, and consciousness. Okay? And in my own experience, my birth certificate says I'm colored. Okay, my parents, it says we're colored too. My baptismal certificate says I'm a Negro. My elementary school degree says I'm Black. My high school diploma says I'm Afro-American. Okay. My first degree says African American without the hyphen. And my passport says I'm American. So if I'm a little schizophrenic, you have to understand that there's a genuine legitimacy embedded in that. So what is race? Color, culture, and consciousness. Okay. And a friend used to say, the slave exists in all of us. It's just closer to the surface in some and deeper in others, because it may take as long as we were enslaved in this country in order to rid ourselves of the psychological and the mental chains that were associated with that traveled across generations, that still exist in the form of self-hatred in our community, in the south side of Chicago and the north side on Selby Avenue today. And it is important that we try to promote, to do positive images of African people whenever, wherever, and however we can, until it becomes infectious with those around us. Because we cannot do it alone. We will not survive alone. And, we need to liberate our minds as well as our bodies. We need to teach, we need to share, we need to be engaged, whether it's in church or in schools or in fraternities and sororities or wherever we find ourselves around this notion of unity. I consider myself a Pan-African nationalist, okay? And I owe no apology to anyone for that. And I take my inspiration from Black women and men, okay? And I've met very few white people that I wanted to be like, okay? In fact, I'm hard-pressed to name one. I've met some that, a handful, who I think were truly colorblind in the absolute definition of the term, and God bless them, because they include Taylor Branch, they include the fellow who wrote the book, The Blood of Emmett Till, Timothy Tyson, a history professor at Madison University. And the list ain't that long. Okay, there aren't many of them. But, the inspiration, the motivation, the cajoling, and the threatening that I received, okay, to become a race man from the time I was 5 years old came from within our community, okay? And if I have a debt, if I have a responsibility, if I owe anything to anybody, it is from within that same community and race that, is responsible. And I say with no shame whatsoever that I owe everything I am to Black women, okay, who grabbed me by the collar and pulled me aside and told me they were going to whoop my ass if I didn't become accredited at race. And when I went off to get an education, told me I was responsible for bringing that back to the community where I came from. Okay, so here I am, and I fall in love with every Black woman I come face to face with. So ladies, if you're out there, please don't deny me, okay, because my intentions are respectful and honest, all right? But I've been with the same Black woman for 52 years, okay? I talk in my sleep, so I can't do no wrong, or I might not wake up tomorrow morning.
There you go. There you go. Yoji, let me ask you to talk about the connection between the 100 million Africans in Brazil and the 100+ million Africans on the continent in Nigeria. Going home is the question and the theme. And what does it mean for Black people to go home? and that can be taken at any level, home into the culture, home to the geography, home to
Home to the heart.
the heart. So what do you think when Lagos and Bahia are connecting? What's happening, and why must it continue, Brother Senna? Maybe he didn't hear me. Did you hear me, Yoji? So maybe let's come back to that then. So Angela, let me sort of have you sort of move us towards wrapping the conversation up. I keep wanting to ask you to talk about the vision of how we reorganize, how we center reorganizing humanity in our experience, in our knowledge, and in our wisdom. And part of that, it seems to me, is a critical examination of the patriarchy and exploring, are there other systems of order that can deliver an appreciation of both balance and justice in the world?
I think that's, what we are trying to work out. This has been something that Black internationalists, particularly Black internationalist women, which was a movement during the early 1900s of Black folk who would be, just as I said, internationalists, so would go to different parts of the world, right, and connect and write and publish. I was really happy to hear that you're publishing Venezuelan in Spanish and in English in your paper, because this is the history of Black newspapers. Even in the NAACP in the early 1930s in New York City, they had a NAACP booth that was enlisting Black servicemen to go to Ethiopia to fight the invasion of Ethiopia. So, there's been a long history of Black folk who have organized and looked to other Black folk for ideas. This has come out of also the anti-colonial projects that we saw in Africa.
You went mute, Angela. You got muted.
Sometimes the communist projects that happened across the Caribbean and happened across Latin America and Africa, which, the U.S. did push back on. Were all of these projects perfect? No, right? But at the core is that Black folk, what we need to keep doing, even to something like the NAACP or these Black historical legacy organizations, are they always perfect? No, but we have to keep trying. And like Mr. Yusuf said earlier, is that this is more than an obligation. This is more than a commitment. This is more than, okay, I'm just going to do this one day out of the month, right? Or when I get to it, or when I feel like it. Our commitment to our community has to be a commitment to our survival, and whatever we can do to organize it, whether it is voting. I know people don't want to vote. People are, they don't want to vote, and they don't like people who say just go and vote. But until that tool is fully realized, where all Black people vote, we can't stop saying go vote, right? I know a lot of people don't like Black politicians or Black politicians, but until we actually have a Congress or a governing body that actually represents us, we can't stop putting people up and can't stop supporting who we might trust to run for office. And so I know people don't even want to go to college, right? We're saying college is not worth it. It's expensive, and it is. But until we are educated and until we have fully utilized that tool, we can't say it doesn't work. And so I personally believe in democracy. I personally believe that there is a path forward for us in this country, where our legacy and the next generations after us and our descendants do have options that are not presented to us, and power not presented to us currently, but we cannot stop. That's the thing. We cannot stop on relying on the traditional and also innovative tools that might organize our society. And to say that, oh, this didn't work, is to also be ahistorical, because we haven't really put full effort into a certain strategy as of yet. And that even goes towards our democracy and participation of it.
Yoji, let me close with you. Before I went to Angela, I was trying to ask you as a comment. Maybe you didn't hear me, but the question I raised was, what does the concept of going home mean? And I put that out there so that you could respond at any and all levels, meaning the question that you have gone home from Minnesota to Bahia, meaning that you are involved in conversations that connect Yoruba in Brazil with Yoruba in Lagos, meaning that all of us, as Youssef has described, have a number of labels that we speak from, but we decide to speak from a centeredness of our Africanity, meaning, as Jonathan Palmer has said, you can wear and be home in more than one place at a time. So, Yoji, what were your thoughts? I don't know if I've lost
You
Yoji.
just lost Yoji.
Just lost Yoji. Well, listen.
Can I add something before we pick out that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a really key point there, because being here at this session, if you look at my cover photo on Facebook, you will see the members of Clan McFarlane that are here. You will see 2 brown faces in that. Our clan had 2 brown faces. In one of the other clans has hired an executive director for their society who is Black and British. And so you're starting to see people, not a single person has batted an eye that I've been out here in a kilt. Not a single person has looked at me funny or said something wrong. I've met nothing but open arms with regards to this. And when you talk about coming home, there's a connection I feel to this country and to these places because of how much, my family roots are here. And my next trip is going to be to Africa. And I anticipate feeling that same peace, that same connection when I go there, so that you can have that in more than one place. But the idea of Black and brown people only being in the United States or only being in America or certain places isn't true. Angela just pointed out Black people have been in Europe since antiquity. That is so true. Egypt was the center of learning. People came from all over. We have been all over this planet, but people don't realize that because the history books don't reflect that. So when you see me or somebody else embracing the other side of their heritage, it is not just us connecting in, but it's a matter of reflecting the fact that Black and brown people have been a part of every culture, and we are connected into every culture, and we have a place in everyone that we can go ahead and say, we're here, we're a part of you, we can speak the language, we can represent just as well as anybody else with paler skin.
Jonathan, 2 quick points. 1, the patron saint of Germany, okay? Maurice of Aganon. The patron saint of Russia, Pushkin. These 2 have one striking thing in common. They were both Africans, all right? To your point.
Mm-hmm.
Black people everywhere.
Alessandro Medici, the Prince Alessandro Medici was Black. Alexandre Dumas, the writer of the Conte de Monte Cristo, was Black. Exactly. There's so many fantastic histories. Actually, The Count is a really good book. It's about actually Alexandre Dumas and his father, who was a Black revolutionary during the French Revolution and was pushed out by Napoleon.
He lost by 1 vote, becoming the general of all of the armies of France. And Napoleon showed his disdain by imprisoning Alexander I, okay? And his son was the one who wrote the Count of Monte Cristo. His grandson was the one who created Western theater, okay? And the acting that we see at the Guthrie and other places today. So,
well, and the British.
Plus, there was a brother in New York City who was a poet named Alexander Dumas, who was killed 25 years old, shot by mistake by a subway policeman. And incredible poet, Alexander Dumas. Yeah.
And Bridget, and my understanding, Bridgerton is basically following up on the notion that Queen Charlotte was black. That it was long a rumored piece, and actually I took a picture of one of the portraits over here that has her with white skin, but the features, you can understand why somebody is saying, "Hey, we don't know the whole story here."
If you follow her line to Spain, when conquered by the Moors, right? The Moors brought over a bunch of African descendants also into Spain.
And they weren't sleeping with the elephants.
So, it really was one of those things. So, yes, she's definitely black if you trace her line, and there's a lot of
the Moors controlled Spain for 700 years. Europe's first university, the University of Salamanca, is where? In Spain, created by Hannibal and the Moors. Okay.
And that's exactly the history. There's no disputing it. And that's one of the things of legibility, where our history has been deemed illegible and erased. That is a large part of it, where, with Alessandro de' Medici, it's well known his mother was black, a black servant in his father's household. And, what they just did then is just didn't talk about it, which is, much of why in the South we got two white parents, but one black baby. People just don't talk about it sometimes.
He just really tan. That's all that is. He just, he out in the sun a lot.
So the question becomes for me, again, the question of examining and connecting, discovering the truth that DNA holds, and bringing it to light, bringing it to awareness, to regular conversation in families, exploring connectivity. And all of us, I think, are excited and have experienced the excitement of reconnecting with Africa, either through DNA or through genealogy, or just through reading, through literature, through moving past the stereotyped caricature of our humanity by the system of white supremacist thought, by the lie of white invincibility, and what we have been able to both survive and demonstrate a resilience against and from. But as we continue emerging as our resilient, authentic selves, that emergence, Jonathan, I believe, leads us back to the authentic, genuine genealogical ties, some of which can be demonstrated, some of which cannot. But they're there, and the DNA roadmap validates these relationships, some of them forced, but they are what they are. And the science is what it is. Do you see this as part of the grand scheme of change? England, as far as my cousins tell me, doesn't know what to do with all the black people and brown people in London. And so where once they crowed about the sun never setting on the empire has gone to London, and the English, the whites, are probably pretty damned upset that their convenience is being encroached upon by those that they dominated. And so the future, just like this country, means that all of the world would be browned at one level or another. What do you think the strategy will be? Is it simply what happens, or will there be some intentionality in undoing the consequences of white supremacist thought by our presence in our family lines in Europe and elsewhere?
I think actually you've seen it happen in the United States first with the atrocity that was overturning Roe versus Wade. I think that going ahead and decreasing the personhood of women by taking away choice regardless of whether you're pro-life, pro-abortion, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is we're talking about who gets to control their own body.
Mm-hmm.
And what you will find is that rich people, primarily white, will always have access to abortion, to other resources that they need. And it is always those without resources, primarily people of color, who will end up being in the more desperate situations, being imprisoned, which takes away, that you've got to connect the dots. If you're caught, helping somebody, or you're getting an abortion in some of the states, you can be arrested, you can be thrown in jail. You know what happens to people who have a felony record? They can't vote. So when you start looking at how the pieces are all connected in here, the fear of being overrun by Black and brown people is
the fear of genetic annihilation.
Yes. So I think you're going to see the same kind of principles and practices flourish out into other parts of the world. It's incumbent upon all of us, but especially upon men, to step up and say that this is wrong, and say that women need to be treated as humans, as people with the same civil rights as everybody else, and that these choices, we're going to have to recognize that the Supreme Court has been compromised. It is not acting as an impartial legal body. It is acting as a partisan and a religious organization that is not part of what was intended by the Constitution or by the quote unquote founding fathers. And while Angela says a Black man compromised it, I don't think there's a Black man on the Supreme Court right now. Luckily, we got a Black woman, but I think you got somebody who's under the illusion of inclusion who may be very dark, but that's not a Black man. That's my opinion.
You close us out with the question we opened with, Civil War. Civil War, not only here, but in the context of conflict around the planet. Will there be civil war?
Well, I would remind people or inform those who joined us late of the book by Barbara Walter entitled How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, which is available on Amazon, released earlier this year. And the fact that the CIA since 1946 has been categorizing social criteria within each country that would suggest greater or lesser possibility of civil war, of armed conflict, and how the United States is slowly sliding down that scale. A positive 10 means you're among the most democratic, safe countries in the world, and a negative 10 means that civil war or armed conflict could occur at any moment. And the United States has gone from an 8 to a 5 on the plus scale back to an 8, indicating some of the, Charlottesville, the January 6th insurrection, Boogaloo Boys, etc., type behavior within the United States, and the behavior, frankly, within the Republican Party about denial, about the all but public endorsement of white supremacy and manifest destiny. And this book identifies parallels between what's happening in America today and what happened in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and also identifies similar criteria that exist in other countries around the world, and talks about their significance. I think that we are in an age, not just a moment, of global uncertainty in terms of power shifting, in terms of armed struggle, in terms of autocracy, and the struggle for democracy that knows no borders. We see it on the African continent. We see it on the European continent, on the Asian continent, the sub-Asian continent, around the planet. And the recent appetite for political correctness turning to the extreme right ought to be alarming to any intelligent, decent human beings, regardless of their race, their history, or their ethnicity. And I think that that, coupled with climate change, does not bode well. We are nearing a point of no return of where the damage to our environment and our climate and our lives is reaching the point of no return. And if we don't act, we see all of the fires, all of the mudslides, all of the droughts, all of the, the glaciers and the Arctic ice shelves and Antarctic ice shelves breaking, the possibility of the ocean rising 3 feet, which would affect about 40% of the people in our country. And these are ominous signs. These are like the Aztecs seeing the eclipse for the first time, except that we know what's going on. We know where it came from. We know how to address it. The question is whether or not we have the will and the commitment and the courage to face it and to deal with it. So life goes on, but perilously, if at all.
Let's leave it right there. Angela, Jonathan, Brenda, Yoji, who left, thank you all for being here. What a great conversation, and what a wonderful time to be together. Thank you. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
God bless you the best.
Bye-bye, guys.
Yeah.
Peace. Stay safe.